Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, down slicers, peasants, vassals, brokers who are broke, brokers who are broke. I'm a useful idiot. And today I want to talk about the weird fact that we have a financial world that is full of fiction, fraud, and fantasy. And it's all a confidence game. And people talk about that a lot. A house of cards, smoke and mirrors, a fantasy game, gambling. And it is exactly that. And in fact, the real markets, the real stock markets and the future trades and the derivatives market and everything that the banks really want to do, the too big to fail banks, is almost science fiction and completely abstract. I think a good term for it that was coined is impossible objects. So we have all these exotic financial instruments created for the elite players in the markets. And most of the derivatives market, of course, is primarily the 5 top banks on Wall Street in the United States. And this whole market worldwide is said to be about $1.2 quadrillion in notional value, with $12 million in cash at risk. And just that entire foundation that these giant banks are built on, the derivatives market, is starts off in a fraud, fantasy, fiction world with a financial product that is derived from another financial product. And but I'm going to get into the details about that a little later, because let's start off with just the very foundations of our banking industry and our financial industry and why it is fantasy, fraud, and fiction. Just starting with fractional reserve banking. And when they talk about leverage in banks, they're talking about how much they loan out against their supposed assets. So if your assets are all fake, so then what you loan out is fake on top of that. And that's what I mean by fiction, fraud, and fantasy. These things that only exist in cyberspace. They are completely abstract. And yet it's a system that generates vast wealth for a chosen few. Fractional reserve, if a bank has $10, you'd think they'd loan out, let's say, $20. But instead, our leverage ratios are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 times to 1. We have no way of knowing what the actual leverage is if all the numbers are actually adjusted to their actualities. And but that's part of this whole system. It's meant for them. The crumbs that are left for the average investors are just to get the institutional players. You're like the sucker at a card game that's rigged by a few fast talkers, and that is the elites at the top. And they only allow people to enter the market so they can suck up that wealth as well. So fractional reserve, of course, right off the bat, is fantasy, fiction, and fraud. And the fact that we have an entire monetary system that's based on a fiat currency backed by nothing, obviously, is the ultimate fantasy. The fact that 3% of money exists physically in the world, the other 97% is in cyberspace. It doesn't even exist. They're just numbers pushed around by the Federal Reserve and the banks and our entire system. And the fact that it's not backed by anything obviously has been in the headlines a lot, and a limited amount of money printing and the circle jerk going on between the Federal Reserve buying treasuries from the government and propping up a broke government and the broke banks. So yeah, you have your leverage, you have your fractional reserve system, then you have hypothecation and rehypothecation. And just the fact that it's based on the word hypothetical should tell you something. And that's where a bank sells a loan. And then that bank can sell it to another bank and sell these loans ad nauseum. And they can do this with stocks and bonds and securities. And with rehypothecation, it can be sold infinitely to end up in the hands of any number of different institutions, all having a right to the piece of the pie. Of course, until the going gets rough, and then they don't want to have anything to do with it. And according to some pundits in the City of London banking system, you can rehypothecate hundreds, if not thousands of times. And so this is all fantasy and fiction and fraud. And high-frequency trading. High-frequency trading is a great example of fantasy, fiction, and fraud. The fact that they can just electronically hook up to rent a spot at the stock exchange, hook up these machines, and then they work in milliseconds. That's literally a 1/1,000,000th of a second. And they artificially pump in market movements, either shorting or going long or adjusting prices with all these fake trades. And the entire market now is 80 to 90% high-frequency trading. There isn't even really that many humans. So talk about the ultimate fiction, fraud, and fantasy. The stock market now being 80 to 90% algorithms in computers just skimming off all this market movement. And that's where they're making their money now. And the other part of hypothecation and rehypothecation that's treacherous is as all these loans are sold and passed on from bank to bank to bank, they're held at full value, even if those assets have deteriorated. And that's why all the banks are broke, because if you keep passing on these loans and the values have deteriorated all along the way, nobody's made any adjustments. They don't really have that many assets on their books. And that's another big part of our fiction, fraud, fantasy financial system and our financial markets. And then you have futures contracts, which is when they talk about going to the gambling table, that's exactly what they're talking about. Just betting on stocks and commodity prices and market movements, stock markets up and down, and whether they push it up or push it down, they're making these futures contracts, and that's where the big money is. And it's quick and easy, but there's a lot of risk involved. And then at the heart of the financial industry, of course, is interest. And that's all fiction, fraud, and fantasies we now know, because they just manipulate all the interest rates worldwide, and all the banks are doing it. They all know about it. Everybody knows they're all doing it, and that's part of the fraud, fiction, and fantasy. They just make up these interest rates. And interestingly enough, if you look at the low end of interest, let's say bank fees, used to be without computers, it was 30 cents to process an NSF, their actual cost, and their fee to the user was $6. But in the digital age, their actual cost is less than 1 cent, and yet the fee for an NSF or a non-sufficient fund check is $28 to $40. And but of course, when you get into bank-to-bank situations, they're nowhere near the kind of interest rates they charge their customers. But there's another example of fraud, fiction, and fantasy. This amount of money that banks think they're due for their minimal services, and the fact that they don't provide much interest on savings accounts. But of course, that has a lot to do with our old friend Benny at the Federal Reserve. And so, you know, the derivatives market, you have these mortgage-backed securities as well. Same process as hypothecation, rehypothecation, where these loans and debts are rolled up, cut up, and rolled up, and resold, and repackaged, and sold again and again and again. And all fantasy and fiction. These exotic financial instruments, they're financial product derived from another financial product. They have no meaning. They produce nothing. They're merely vehicles for financial wheeler and dealers that like to bet on everything going on in the world, including food prices and energy prices. And then, of course, you have short selling, which is basically just betting that some stocks are going to go down. So even when things aren't going well economically, a lot of people in that arena are positioned to capitalize on it and make a lot of money. So don't be fooled by the fact that there's a lot of volatility and huge dips in the market. Still, in the world of our financial world of fraud, fiction, and fantasy, there's always a winner. Then you have interest rate swaps, and you have currency swaps, and wash trades, and all kinds of nonsense. And it's all just smoke and mirrors and ways to trick the market for fun and profit, and huge amounts of profits, needless to say. So at the heart of it, derivatives, and this is the ultimate fraud, fiction, and fantasy. And I want to do another video just on derivatives because there have been some interesting moves recently to completely water down derivatives, which is what banks are really after. That's the heart of the beast. That's their bread and butter. And at the heart of that is credit default swaps, which is essentially insurance between counterparties, and it has to do with making sure risk and credit is shifted around so that everybody makes a lot of money until things go bad. And most of the time it doesn't, but we've seen a lot of volatility, and there's been a lot of winners and losers in the credit default swap games now. But banks set these up for corporations and governments and businesses and investors, and they're even known to sell them to people who don't even know what they're getting into. And a lot of people in the banking industry claim they don't even understand how all these credit default swaps and everything work. So anyway, but at the one of the interesting things, and at the heart of a credit default swap and a derivative that's part of this fraud, fiction, and fantasy, is that it can be bought on a reference asset that isn't even necessarily owned. And you can long or short these positions, but you don't even have to necessarily own what you're buying this credit default swap on. You're just playing gambling in the credit default swap market, and that's where things get hairy, because if something does happen, everybody has to come up with some collateral, come up with some actual assets. So anyway. And I think Albert Einstein said, had a good quote about this whole fiction, fraud, fantasy. Quote, "Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it collects it. He who doesn't pays it." Unquote. So there is our financial system, and it's all a confidence game, and it only survives and exists as long as everyone says it does. And I just think that it's ironic that all the vast wealth, generated, all the wealth generated through the stock market, and every single event and person and place on this planet playing in this huge game that's all a charade. It really boggles the mind when you think about it. And the only thing I would add to that is it's that unfortunate it's gotten to the stage it has now, where the very elite, the very ones at the top, want that amount of money because they want to buy the future. They own everything else. They want to buy the future. And it just was no longer enough to live like kings. They have to live like gods. And this is their little game that they play to do it. Our financial markets. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.